Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. The Freethinker, The Life and Legacy of Milton Friedman. Chapter 1. A Humble Beginning. Milton Friedman was born on July 31, 1912, in Brooklyn, New York. His parents, Sarah and Jenno Friedman, had moved to the United States from a small town in what was then part of Austria-Hungary. They came in search of a better life. Like many immigrants during that time, they were poor, but they had hope. Milton was the fourth and last child in the family. Not long after he was born, the Friedmans moved to Rahway, New Jersey. The family lived in a small apartment above the dry goods store that his mother ran. His father worked as a salesman but often struggled to find steady work. Life was difficult and money was always tight, but Sarah was strong and determined. She taught her children to work hard, value education, and never give up. Milton was a curious child. He loved to read and learn about the world. Even when he was very young, he would ask big questions. He wanted to understand how things worked, especially when it came to people and society. His mother noticed this early. She often said, "Milton is always thinking." One tragic event shaped Milton deeply. When he was just 15 years old, his father passed away. This was a hard time for the family, both emotionally and financially, but Milton did not give up. In fact, this loss made him even more determined to succeed. He saw how fragile life could be and wanted to make the most of his time. At school, Milton was an excellent student. His teachers saw his potential and encouraged him to aim high. He especially loved mathematics. Numbers made sense to him in a way that words sometimes did not. Math gave him a sense of order and control, which was comforting in a life full of uncertainty. Even though the Friedmans were poor, they believed in education. Milton's older siblings also worked hard to support the family and each other. They helped Milton with his studies and encouraged his dreams. There was a strong sense of unity in the household. During this time, the United States was going through many changes. It was the era after World War I, and the country was facing economic ups and downs. These conditions had a deep impact on Milton. He began to notice how people's lives were affected by decisions made far away in government offices, in banks, and in big businesses. He often wondered, why are some people rich and others poor? Why do prices go up and down? Can we make life more fair through better decisions? These questions stayed with him. Milton didn't know it yet, but these early thoughts would one day lead him to become one of the most respected economic thinkers in the world. His early years were not easy, but they were full of lessons about strength, responsibility, and curiosity. These years formed the foundation of his future. From the streets of Rahway to the lecture halls of great universities, Milton Friedman's story had only just begun. Chapter 2. Shaping a Young Mind. College Years and New Ideas. Milton Friedman began his college journey at Rutgers University in the fall of 1928. He was only 16 years old when he started, unusually young for a college student. At first, he planned to study mathematics. He thought that becoming an actuary would provide a stable and respectable career. It was a practical choice, especially for a young man from a modest background. But his path soon took a very different turn. At Rutgers, Milton discovered a world full of ideas and intellectual challenges. The university was not large, but it offered a strong academic environment. What mattered most were the people he met there in particular. Two professors who had a deep influence on his life, Arthur F. Burns and Homer Jones. Arthur F. Burns was a professor of economics who would later become chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was serious, thoughtful, and demanding, the kind of teacher who expected a lot from his students. Homer Jones, also an economist, was known for being analytical and deeply interested in monetary theory. Both men saw something special in Milton. They didn't just teach him economics. They mentored him, challenged him, and encouraged him to dig deeper into questions about how the economy works. Milton quickly realized that economics was more than just numbers. It was a way to understand how people made choices, how they responded to prices, wages, taxes, and policies. He found it fascinating that small changes in incentives could lead to big changes in behavior. This understanding would become a key theme in his later work. He also noticed that many of the economic theories of the time didn't match what he saw in the real world. He questioned the idea that government always knew best, or that more spending automatically led to better results. These doubts were the beginning of his lifelong mission to explore and explain the true forces that drive economies. During his time at Rutgers, Milton also learned to express his thoughts clearly. He was known for his sharp mind and quick answers in class. But he also began to develop a style of explaining complex ideas in simple terms, a skill that would make him one of the most effective communicators in economics later in life. After earning his bachelor's degree in 1932, Milton was ready for the next challenge, graduate school. He had applied to both the University of Chicago and Columbia University, two of the best schools for economics. He received a scholarship to study at the University of Chicago, but at the last minute, he was also offered financial aid to attend Columbia. The offer came too late, so Milton went ahead with his plans to study at Chicago. Arriving at the University of Chicago in the middle of the Great Depression had a major impact on him. People across the country were suffering, and many economists were trying to explain what had gone wrong. At Chicago, Milton was introduced to the ideas of classical economics, a belief in free markets, limited government, and the importance of individual responsibility. The economics department at Chicago was famous for encouraging debate and independent thinking. Students were taught not just to accept what they were told, but to challenge theories, test ideas, and always ask, what does the evidence say? This intellectual environment suited Milton perfectly. He enjoyed asking difficult questions, finding flaws in arguments, and searching for better explanations. Milton also developed friendships and working relationships with other future leaders in economics. These included George Stigler, who would later win a Nobel Prize, and Rose Director, a brilliant student who would become both his research partner and his wife. In 1933, Milton earned his master's degree from Chicago and then moved on to Columbia University to continue his studies. There, he worked closely with Harold Hotelling, a respected statistician and economist. Hotelling's influence deepened. Milton's interest in using mathematics and statistics to analyze economic problems, a skill that would define much of his early work. It was during these years that Milton began to form his own economic philosophy. He believed that while government had a role to play, especially in creating rules and maintaining order, it should not interfere too much in the free choices of individuals. He started to see that too much control could lead to inefficiency, waste, and even harm. But his views were not yet fully formed. He was still learning, still observing, still gathering evidence. The road ahead would be long, and his ideas would not always be popular. But Milton was determined. He had found his purpose, to use economic science to improve lives, clarify truth, and defend freedom. His college years were more than just an education. They were a transformation. He had arrived as a teenager with a talent for numbers. He left as a young thinker ready to challenge the most powerful ideas of his time. Chapter 3. The Power of Education, Learning Beyond the Classroom. By the mid-1930s, Milton Friedman had studied at two of the most respected universities in the United States, the University of Chicago and Columbia University. But while formal education gave him important tools, it was what happened outside the classroom that truly shaped him as an economist and a thinker. During these years, America was still recovering from the Great Depression. Many families remained unemployed, and fear of economic failure was widespread. Governments around the world were trying new policies, hoping to fix their broken economies. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had launched the New Deal, a set of programs meant to provide relief, reform, and recovery. At first, Milton supported many of these efforts. Like many young economists, he believed that smart government action could help solve big problems. However, as Milton watched and studied more closely, he began to doubt the effectiveness of some of these programs. He noticed that even well-intentioned policies sometimes led to unexpected consequences. For example, when the government set prices too high or too low, it often caused shortages or surpluses. When money was printed too quickly, it led to inflation. These real-world observations taught Milton something vital. Good intentions are not enough. Policies must be judged by their results, not by their promises. In 1935, Milton began working as a research assistant at the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, one of the most respected economic research organizations in the United States. At the NBER, he worked under economist Simon Kuznets, who would later win a Nobel Prize. Together, they studied income distribution, how money was shared among people in different jobs and social classes. This work taught Milton how to use real data to understand economic behavior. He became skilled at finding patterns in large numbers and drawing meaningful conclusions. He also learned to be careful with assumptions. Numbers could tell the truth, but only if used honestly and wisely. This respect for evidence became a core value in all of Milton's future work. While working at NBER, Milton also became more interested in money, how it was created, how it moved through the economy, and how it affected things like inflation, jobs, and growth. This field, known as monetary economics, would eventually become his greatest area of influence. In 1938, he married Rose Director, a fellow economist and former classmate from the University of Chicago. Rose was brilliant in her own right, and the two formed a strong personal and professional partnership. Throughout Milton's career, Rose would be his most trusted advisor, co-author, and lifelong supporter. Their marriage was not only filled with affection, but also deep intellectual respect. They challenged each other's ideas, sharpened each other's thinking, and published many important works together. By this point, Milton had already earned a reputation as a promising economist, but his work was just beginning. In the early 1940s, during World War II, he took a job with the U.S. government. He worked as a statistician for the U.S. Treasury Department, helping analyze taxes and war spending. This experience gave him a front-row seat to the power and danger of large-scale government action. He saw how governments, in times of crisis, often expanded their power. While this was sometimes necessary, it also raised concerns for Milton. He worried that people might grow too comfortable with government control and lose their appreciation for individual freedom. He began to think deeply about the balance between government and the market, a balance that would become the center of his life's work. Milton returned to academia after the war, ready to continue his research. In 1946, he accepted a position as a professor at the University of Chicago, the very place that had once shaped his thinking. Now, it would become the place where he shaped others. Teaching became one of Milton's greatest passions. He believed education was not about memorizing facts, but about learning how to think critically. He challenged his students to question assumptions, explore ideas, and never accept easy answers. Many of his students would go on to become leaders in economics, business, and public policy. His classroom became a space of lively debate, bold thinking, and honest inquiry. One of his most famous sayings was, "There's no such thing as a free lunch." This simple sentence carried a deep message that everything has a cost, even if we don't see it. Whether in economics or in life, Milton taught people to look beyond the surface, to understand the trade-offs, and to choose wisely. The 1940s and early 1950s were a time of deep learning for Milton Friedman. He gathered knowledge not only from books and lectures, but from experience, discussion, and observation. He developed a sharp, clear voice in a field often filled with confusion. And most importantly, he began to build a framework, a way of thinking that would later guide nations. The power of education was not just in receiving knowledge, but in using it to challenge the world, improve it, and protect freedom. This belief stayed with Milton all his life and became one of the greatest gifts he gave to others. Chapter 4. Discovering Economics, a New Way to See the World. By the end of the 1940s, Milton Friedman had built a strong foundation as an economist, teacher, and researcher. But it was in the 1950s that he truly began to shape and challenge the way people thought about economics. During this period, he moved beyond learning and began discovering. His ideas were not just growing, they were becoming a force in the world of economic thought. At the University of Chicago, Milton taught courses in economic theory and statistics. But his real passion was in applying those theories to real-life questions. He believed that economics was not just an academic subject. It was a tool to understand human behavior, how people spend money, how they save, how they react to taxes, inflation, and government control. Most economists at the time believed in something called Keynesian economics, named after British economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes had argued that government spending could help fix the economy, especially during recessions. This idea became popular after the Great Depression and World War II. Many believed that governments should play an active role in managing the economy. Milton, however, was skeptical. He didn't believe that government officials could always make the right choices. He saw how policies, even with good intentions, often failed or caused new problems. He started to argue for a different approach, one that trusted individuals and markets more than government experts. In 1953, Milton published one of his most important academic papers, The Methodology of Positive Economics. In it, he explained that economics should focus on what is, not what ought to be. In other words, economists should describe and predict how people actually behave, not just how they think people should behave. He also said that the value of an economic model wasn't based on whether its assumptions were perfectly realistic, but on whether it could make accurate predictions. This idea challenged many economists at the time, but it became a foundation for modern economic science. Milton's next major project was a long-term study of how people spend and save money. At the time, many economists thought people's spending was mostly based on their current income. But Milton believed that people think about their future, not just their present. He developed the permanent income hypothesis, which said that people plan their spending based on their expected long-term income, not just short-term changes. This idea helped explain why temporary tax cuts or one-time checks don't always lead to higher spending. It also showed how human behavior is more thoughtful and forward-looking than many models had assumed. This theory had major implications for economic policy. If governments wanted to influence the economy, they had to understand how people actually make choices, not just rely on simple formulas. Milton's approach was different from many economists of his time. He didn't trust complex mathematical models unless they matched real-world data. He often tested his ideas using statistics and historical information. This gave his work a strong sense of credibility. He wasn't just building theories, he was discovering truths about how people live and make decisions. As his reputation grew, more people began paying attention. Some admired him for his clear thinking and sharp logic. Others criticized him for being too focused on markets and too skeptical of government. But Milton didn't mind disagreement. In fact, he welcomed it. He believed that through debate and discussion, better ideas could rise. In 1957, he published A Theory of the Consumption Function, a book that became a classic in economics. In it, he laid out the full case for his permanent income hypothesis. The book used data and logic to challenge the traditional Keynesian view. It was not flashy or emotional. It was careful, precise, and convincing. It showed Milton at his best, as a scholar, a thinker, and a teacher. During this time, Milton also became more public in his views. He began writing for broader audiences, not just academic journals. He believed that economic freedom was essential for political freedom. If people couldn't choose how to spend, save, or invest their money, how could they truly be free? This belief would become central to his mission. He wanted to reach not only economists and students, but everyday people, to help them understand how freedom in the marketplace was connected to freedom in life. By the end of the 1950s, Milton Friedman had made a name for himself as a serious challenger to mainstream economics. His work was thoughtful and bold, and it was beginning to change minds. But his biggest influence was still to come. He had discovered not just a new way of thinking, but a new way of seeing the world, and he was determined to share it. Chapter 5. Rising Through the Ranks. From Scholar to National Voice. By the early 1960s, Milton Friedman had become one of the most respected economists in the academic world. His ideas were spreading, and his voice was growing louder, not only in university lecture halls, but also in national discussions about money, markets, and freedom. He was no longer just a scholar. He was becoming a public intellectual, someone whose thoughts could influence policy, politics, and people's lives. At the University of Chicago, Friedman continued to teach and research. He was part of a group of economists known as the Chicago School, a label that would later become famous around the world. These economists shared a belief in the power of free markets, limited government, and the importance of individual choice. They did not all agree on everything, but they supported the idea that economic freedom was essential to prosperity and human progress. Milton was one of the most outspoken members of this group. He believed that many government programs, while created to help, often made things worse. He often said that government failures were more common than market failures, and that markets, when left alone, could often solve problems more efficiently than central planners. In 1962, he published a book that would change everything, Capitalism and Freedom. It was short, clear, and powerful. In this book, Milton argued that political freedom and economic freedom go hand in hand. If people were not free to buy, sell, and trade, then they were not truly free in any sense. He wrote that the role of government should be limited to protecting individual rights, enforcing laws, and providing certain public goods, but not controlling prices, wages, or how people live their economic lives. The book was controversial. Some praised it as a brave defense of liberty. Others attacked it as cold or uncaring, but it was impossible to ignore. Milton had written it not just for economists, but for citizens. He wanted to speak directly to the people, to make complex ideas simple, and to help others see how freedom in the marketplace supported freedom in society. Over time, more readers came to appreciate his message. The book gained attention not just in academic circles, but among business leaders, students, and even politicians. Milton's ideas were bold. He called for ending the military draft, introducing school vouchers, and replacing many welfare programs with a negative income tax, a way to help the poor without removing their incentive to work. His proposal for a negative income tax was especially interesting. He believed that instead of giving people many different kinds of welfare, the government should give direct cash support to those in need, but in a way that encouraged them to earn more. The more a person earned, the less support they would receive. This idea later influenced the development of the Earned Income Tax Credit, a program still used in the US today. At the same time, Milton was continuing his deep research into monetary policy, the way central banks control the supply of money. He believed that poor monetary policy had caused the Great Depression and that central banks could do more harm than good when they tried to fine-tune the economy. He argued for clear rules, not guesses. One of his most famous suggestions was that the money supply should grow at a steady, predictable rate, not too fast, not too slow. These ideas were not always popular, especially among those who believed in strong government action. But Milton didn't shy away from disagreement. He enjoyed debate, and he treated those who disagreed with him with respect, as long as they argued with facts and logic. By the mid-1960s, Milton Friedman had become a familiar face in public discussions. He gave talks across the country, appeared on radio programs, and wrote articles for major newspapers. His communication style was simple but not shallow. He could take the most complex ideas and explain them clearly without talking down to his audience. This gift made him an effective teacher not only in the classroom but in the public square. He believed that ideas had power, real power, to shape history. He often said only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. His goal was to prepare better ideas so that when the next crisis came, people would have something wiser to turn to. He was also deeply committed to the principle of freedom of choice. Whether in education, healthcare, or business, he believed that people should have the right to choose what was best for them. He thought that when individuals are allowed to decide for themselves, they often make better decisions than distant politicians or bureaucrats. Milton's influence was not just in economics, It was in the way people thought about responsibility, freedom, and the role of government. He was giving people a new lens through which to see the world. For many, it was eye-opening. By the end of the 1960s, Friedman had risen through the academic ranks and had become much more than a professor. He was now a national figure, a thought leader whose ideas were shaping conversations at the highest levels. His journey was far from over, but the foundation was set. He had found his voice, and the world was beginning to listen. Chapter 6. The Voice of Liberty. Reaching the World. As the 1970s began, Milton Friedman stood at the peak of both his academic career and public visibility. His ideas had moved from university classrooms into political debates and living rooms around the world. He was no longer only a respected economist. He had become a global advocate for liberty, using his voice to challenge governments, shift policies, and open minds. One of the major turning points came in 1970, when he began writing a regular column for Newsweek, one of the most widely read magazines in the United States. His columns appeared every 3 weeks, alternating with other prominent economists, like Paul Samuelson. Through these short but powerful essays, Milton reached millions of readers with his free market ideas. He tackled real-world issues, taxes, education, inflation, welfare, and showed how economics could offer practical solutions grounded in freedom and responsibility. He didn't write in complicated academic language. He used clear, direct English, filled with logic, evidence, and sometimes humor. His goal was to educate the public, not just impress other economists. And while many disagreed with him, few could deny the clarity of his thinking or the strength of his convictions. At the same time, inflation was rising rapidly in the United States. Prices were going up, unemployment was increasing, and traditional economic policies were failing. Many people turned to the government for answers, but the policies being used, especially printing more money, only made things worse. Friedman had warned for years that inflation was a monetary phenomenon. He argued that when central banks created too much money, prices would rise, not instantly, but surely. His ideas about monetarism, the belief that control of the money supply is key to economic stability, began to receive more attention. In 1976, his lifetime of research was recognized with the highest honor in the field, the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. He was awarded for his work on consumption analysis, monetary history, and the complexity of stabilization policy. The Nobel Committee praised him not only for his theory, but also for the way he combined deep knowledge with strong practical insight. Though honored, Milton did not let the prize slow him down. In fact, he used the new attention to speak more broadly to audiences who had never studied economics, but were eager to understand the forces shaping their lives. One of the most important projects of his career came soon after, a television series and book titled Free to Choose, which he co-created with his wife, Rose Friedman. The series was broadcast on public television in 1980, reaching millions of viewers in the US and around the world. It presented a powerful, passionate argument for personal freedom and limited government, using real stories and examples to make economic ideas come alive. Each episode focused on a theme, such as education, poverty, trade, or regulation, and explained how freedom, not government control, led to better outcomes. The Friedmans traveled to cities, factories, schools, and homes to show how policies affected real people. The show didn't rely on charts or theories alone. It connected policy to people's lives. The companion book, also titled Free to Choose, became a bestseller. It was written in simple, elegant language and brought Milton's economic philosophy to a global audience. It was translated into many languages and used in classrooms, public debates, and government offices. What made Free to Choose so impactful was its moral clarity. It wasn't just about money or markets, it was about human dignity. Milton believed that when people are free to make their own decisions, they are more creative, more responsible, and more able to live meaningful lives. His message found listeners far beyond the United States. In countries struggling with inflation, poverty, and government overreach, Friedman's voice offered hope. He traveled to places like Japan, Chile, the United Kingdom, and Eastern Europe, meeting with leaders and students, encouraging reform, and sharing his belief in economic liberty. Some of these trips, like his visit to Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship, drew criticism, though he did not support authoritarian governments. His willingness to advise on economic reform in such environments sparked controversy. Milton always maintained that his role was to promote freedom, and that sound economic policy could help people escape poverty and oppression, even under difficult regimes. Throughout all of this, Rose was by his side. Their partnership remained strong, and her influence was deeply felt in their writing, thinking, and shared mission. Together, they championed the idea that economic freedom was not just about efficiency, it was about justice and opportunity. By the early 1980s, Milton Friedman was one of the most influential voices in economics worldwide. Presidents, prime ministers, and policymakers listened to him, but so did everyday citizens. He had become more than a scholar. He was a teacher to the world. He once said, "The great advances of civilization, whether in architecture or painting, in science or literature, in industry or agriculture, have never come from centralized government. Instead, he believed, progress came from free individuals, driven by curiosity, creativity, and the desire to improve their own lives." Milton Friedman had become the voice of liberty, a voice that challenged power, trusted people, and taught the world that economic ideas could change not just markets, but lives. Chapter 7. Global Influence and Controversy. Ideas Without Borders. By the early 1980s, Milton Friedman's voice had extended well beyond the borders of the United States. His ideas had become part of a global conversation about freedom, responsibility, and economic reform. Though widely respected, he was also deeply controversial. To his supporters, he was a champion of liberty and progress. To his critics, he was a symbol of capitalism's harshest edges. But one thing was clear: his influence could no longer be ignored. As developing countries faced debt crises and inflation, and as post-colonial governments struggled to build stable economies, many turned to market-based reforms. Friedman's core message, that economic freedom leads to personal and national prosperity, found a receptive audience in leaders looking for alternatives to failed state-controlled systems. One of the most debated examples of his global influence was Chile. In the 1970s, Chile had undergone a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet, who overthrew the elected socialist government. Pinochet's regime became infamous for human rights abuses. During this period, a group of Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago, often called the Chicago Boys, began to reform Chile's economy based on Friedman's ideas. Milton himself visited Chile in 1975, where he gave a public lecture and met briefly with Pinochet. He advised on reducing inflation, cutting government spending, and opening markets. He believed that sound economic policy could improve people's lives, even in an authoritarian context, and that economic freedom could eventually lead to political freedom. This visit sparked intense controversy. Critics accused Friedman of supporting dictatorship, but he firmly denied this. He said that advising a government on better economic policy did not mean approving of its political actions. In fact, he gave similar advice to Communist China, Democratic Britain, and liberal Japan. His goal, he insisted, was always to promote economic reform and human welfare. While the debate around Chile continued, the impact of Friedman's ideas there was undeniable. The country's inflation dropped, markets stabilized, and Chile eventually transitioned to democracy. In the decades that followed, it became one of Latin America's strongest economies, a fact often cited by both supporters and critics of Friedman's legacy. Friedman's influence also reached the United Kingdom, where his ideas inspired key members of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government. Thatcher herself was deeply influenced by his belief in smaller government and free enterprise. She once carried Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom in her bag and quoted him in speeches. Similarly, in the United States, President Ronald Reagan was drawn to Friedman's views. Though not always in complete agreement, Reagan frequently used Friedman's logic to argue for lower taxes, less regulation, and a stronger belief in individual responsibility. Friedman met with Reagan and his advisors, offering guidance on economic matters, especially in fighting inflation and reviving growth. Yet, despite these high-level connections, Milton never sought political office or power. He always saw himself as a teacher, not a politician. He believed his role was to offer clear, tested ideas, not to run for votes or pass laws. His strength lay in persuasion, not authority. Friedman's message continued to spread through his books, lectures, and media appearances. He traveled to Asia, Europe, Africa, and Australia, speaking in universities, meeting with economists, and debating policies. In many countries, he found young people hungry for new ideas, people who had grown up under heavy government control and were eager to explore what freedom could mean for their futures. In post-communist Eastern Europe, where governments had collapsed and economies were in ruins, Friedman's thoughts on free markets became particularly attractive. While he did not directly shape all reforms, many economists in Poland, Estonia, and the Czech Republic studied his work and adapted his ideas to fit their national needs. As his global profile rose, so did the criticism. Some economists argued that his policies focused too much on efficiency and ignored inequality. Others said that deregulated markets could lead to corporate abuse, environmental damage, or financial crises. Milton responded not by denying these risks, but by emphasizing that freedom includes the freedom to fail and that the alternative, giving governments total control, was far more dangerous. He also pointed out that economic freedom was not a complete solution. It was a necessary condition for prosperity and peace, but not a guarantee. Societies still needed ethics, rule of law, education, and civic engagement. Markets could help lift people out of poverty, but they could not replace personal responsibility or moral values. Milton often reminded his audiences that no system is perfect, but that free markets give people the best tools to improve their own lives. He was also careful to separate his views from blind ideology. He said, "I'm not pro-business. I'm pro-free enterprise." He criticized special interests, corporate subsidies, and any use of government power to benefit one group at the expense of others. His goal was a level playing field, one where everyone had a fair chance to succeed, based on merit and effort. By the late 1980s, Friedman was no longer writing for Newsweek, and he had officially retired from teaching, but his work continued. He published more books, gave interviews, and spoke at conferences. He was still sharp, still curious, and still committed to spreading the message of freedom. What made him stand out wasn't just the content of his ideas, but the confidence and consistency with which he presented them, always grounded in facts, always open to debate, and always focused on human dignity. Milton Friedman had become a global figure. Some saw him as a hero, others as a challenge, but no one could deny the reach of his ideas or the honesty of his intent. He had crossed borders not just with passports, but with principles, carrying a message that continues to shape the world. Chapter 8. A Life Well Spent, Retirement, Reflection, and Lasting Lessons. In 1977, Milton Friedman officially retired from his position at the University of Chicago after more than 3 decades of teaching and research. But retirement for Milton didn't mean stepping away from public life or abandoning his mission. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase, one focused on reflection, writing, mentoring, and deepening the message he had carried for so many years. Shortly after retiring, he and Rose moved to San Francisco, California. There, they joined the Hoover Institution at Stanford University as senior research fellows. The climate suited them, both the sunny weather and the intellectual environment. The couple continued to write, speak, and influence policy long after they left the classroom. In California, Milton enjoyed a slower pace of life. He took walks with Rose, read extensively, and spent more time with family and friends. But he remained deeply engaged in public debate. He still wrote articles, gave interviews, and answered letters from readers around the world, from curious students to heads of state. Even in his 70s and 80s, his mind was sharp, his arguments firm, and his curiosity alive. One of his major focuses during these years was education reform. He believed deeply that education was the foundation of opportunity, but that the U.S. public school system was failing many children, especially those from low-income families. He argued that simply increasing funding was not enough. What mattered more was choice. Milton and Rose became strong advocates for school vouchers, a policy that would give families public funds to spend on private schools if they believed those schools would better serve their children. His belief was simple but powerful. Competition improves quality. If schools had to compete for students, they would be more innovative, more responsible, and more responsive to parents' needs. In 1996, Milton and Rose established the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice, which continues to promote school choice policies across the United States and beyond. Even in his later years, Milton gave speeches and wrote essays, explaining the moral and economic reasons why families, not governments, should decide where and how their children are educated. He also continued to refine and reflect on his earlier work. In several interviews, he spoke about the lessons of his life and how time had tested his ideas. For example, he acknowledged that deregulation, while often beneficial, must still be accompanied by strong legal institutions to prevent fraud, monopolies, or environmental damage. He was not afraid to clarify or adjust his views, though his core beliefs in liberty, limited government, and free markets remained unchanged. Despite the growing complexity of the world, Friedman maintained a remarkable optimism. He believed that truth and freedom would always find a way, even if it took time. He often quoted Abraham Lincoln saying, "You can't fool all of the people all of the time." Even into his late 80s and early 90s, he stayed active in interviews and public life. He remained intellectually sharp, witty, and deeply committed to the principle that ideas matter. He believed that better policies start with better thinking and that real change begins in people's minds. He also reflected on his partnership with Rose. The two were not only intellectual companions, but also emotional ones. They had built a life together filled with purpose, impact, and love. Their collaboration in books, ideas, and life was a rare and beautiful thing. In interviews, Milton often credited Rose for strengthening his arguments, challenging his assumptions, and bringing warmth to his public image. In 2002, the couple co-authored their final joint book, To Lucky People, a memoir that recounted their journey from humble immigrant roots to international recognition. The title reflected their attitude toward life, one filled with gratitude, not arrogance. They saw themselves not as geniuses, but as fortunate people who had discovered powerful ideas and shared them with the world. Their humility was part of what made them so respected. Despite their fame, they remained grounded, approachable, and deeply human. As Milton grew older, his public appearances became less frequent, but his influence remained powerful. He watched as some of his ideas, such as school choice and the earned income tax credit, became part of mainstream policy discussions. He also saw new generations of economists, thinkers, and leaders pick up where he had left off. Yet, he never saw his work as complete. He believed that freedom must be defended constantly, especially during times of crisis. He warned against the temptation to give governments too much power in the name of safety or equality. He once said, "Nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program." Even near the end of his life, he maintained his belief in the power of individuals, not systems, to create better societies. Milton Friedman passed away on November 16, 2006, at the age of 94. The world lost not just an economist, but a teacher, a communicator, and a champion of human freedom. Yet, his legacy lived on, in the policies he shaped, the minds he inspired, and the countless people who discovered economics through his books, speeches, and stories. His death was mourned by leaders across the political spectrum, from libertarians and conservatives to some liberals who respected his clarity and intellectual honesty. His ideas had left an imprint on every continent, and his voice, clear, logical, and passionate, continued to echo. In retirement, Milton Friedman had not slowed down. he had simply shifted focus from building a career to building a legacy, and that legacy continues to grow. Chapter 9: Legacy and Influence. A World Changed by Ideas. After Milton Friedman's passing in 2006, the world paused to reflect on the legacy of a man who had changed not just the field of economics, but the way millions thought about freedom, responsibility, and the role of government. Across countries and continents, people debated and celebrated his contributions, recognizing that his influence reached far beyond academic circles. Milton's legacy can be felt in four major arenas: economics, public policy, education, and popular thought. 1. In economics, reshaping the foundation. Milton Friedman redefined the role of money in modern economies. His research on monetary policy replaced old assumptions with a deeper understanding of how inflation and interest rates truly work. Before him, many economists believed governments could fine-tune the economy like a machine, increasing spending to fix unemployment or printing money to jumpstart growth. Friedman challenged this. He demonstrated that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon, caused by too much money chasing too few goods. His ideas became part of what is now known as the monetarist school of economics, which has influenced central banks around the world. Today, institutions like the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and others closely monitor the money supply, in part because of Friedman's research. Even economists who disagree with him must respond to the questions he raised. That's how deep his mark on the field has been. Nobel-winning economists like Robert Lucas, Gary Becker, and Thomas Sargent all acknowledged Friedman's impact on their own thinking. Entire generations of scholars were shaped by his bold, clear, and data-driven approach. 2. In public policy, freedom made practical. Beyond academic theory, Friedman's work changed real-world policies. Some of the most important examples include the end of military conscription. Milton argued against the military draft, believing that a volunteer army was more moral and effective. His advocacy helped persuade the US government to end the draft in the 1970s. School choice, his vision of empowering parents through vouchers became a centerpiece in debates about public education, especially in low-income areas. Welfare reform. Friedman proposed the idea of a negative income tax, which influenced the creation of the Earned Income Tax Credit, EITC, a program that helps low-income working families. Privatization and deregulation. Many countries in the 1980s and 1990s, including the US, UK, New Zealand, and parts of Eastern Europe, adopted policies that reduced state control over industries. These reforms were often inspired by Friedman's belief in free markets and limited government. Pension and retirement systems. Several governments explored individual retirement accounts, modeled on Friedman's ideas about personal savings and responsibility. While not all of these reforms turned out perfectly, each carried a clear fingerprint of Friedman's belief that people, not governments, should be trusted to make their own choices. 3. In education, a legacy of learning. Milton was always a teacher at heart, and one of his greatest achievements was the way he made complex ideas understandable to ordinary people. His books, especially Capitalism and Freedom and Free to Choose, continue to be read in universities and by self-learners alike. Free to Choose became a gateway into economics for millions, offering real-life examples and simple explanations without oversimplifying the ideas. The Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice continues to promote his vision of educational reform and opportunity, especially for underserved communities. Through seminars, publications, and policy advocacy, the foundation spreads his ideas with the same clarity and passion he championed during his life. Perhaps most importantly, his work has helped demystify economics for non-experts. He taught people that they didn't need to be economists to understand how policies affect prices, jobs, or freedom. 4. In popular thought, an idea whose time came, Milton Friedman wasn't just influential, he became iconic. His image and voice appeared in documentaries, debates, and social media posts long after his death. He is regularly quoted in discussions about taxes, trade, inflation, and liberty. His phrase, "There's no such thing as a free lunch," has become part of everyday language. In a world where government spending has grown rapidly and debates over capitalism and socialism have intensified, Friedman's voice is often invoked both by supporters and critics. He is praised for warning against government overreach, for defending individual responsibility, and for insisting that freedom works. At the same time, he is challenged by those who feel that markets alone cannot solve problems like inequality, climate change, or systemic injustice. Friedman would likely have welcomed these debates. He believed that open discussion was the only way to discover truth. In fact, he often encouraged people to challenge their own beliefs, to test theories with evidence, and to trust people more than plans. His life showed that one person, with clear thinking and courage, could influence entire nations. He proved that economics wasn't just about numbers, it was about people, about freedom, and about the choices we make every day. And he never gave up on the power of persuasion. As he once said, the role of the economist is not to change policy, but to keep good ideas alive until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. That's exactly what he did. His name lives on, not because he was always right, but because he never stopped asking the right questions. Not because he held power, but because he inspired minds. Not because he followed trends, but because he shaped them. Milton Friedman left us with more than theories. He left us with a powerful lesson, that the most important ideas are those that honor the dignity and potential of every individual. Chapter 10. The Enduring Flame. Why Milton Friedman Still Matters. More than a decade after his death, the ideas of Milton Friedman continue to shape global conversations about freedom, fairness, and the future. His flame has not dimmed. In fact, in times of uncertainty and change, it seems to burn even brighter, a symbol of clarity, courage, and conviction in a world full of noise. Why does Milton Friedman still matter? The answer lies not only in the success of his economic theories, but also in the spirit of his thought, an unshakable belief in the power of individuals to solve problems, make choices, and live meaningful lives, free from unnecessary control. 1. Ideas for a changing world. The 21st century has brought dramatic shifts, digital revolutions, climate challenges, growing inequality, and debates over globalization. In such a fast-changing world, some may wonder if Friedman's ideas are still relevant, but in many ways, his core questions are more urgent than ever. How much power should governments have over our daily lives? What is the balance between equality and liberty? How can we help the poor without making them dependent? What role should markets play in solving social and environmental issues? While times have changed, these questions remain at the heart of economic and political debate. Friedman's writings continue to offer a framework, not answers for every problem, but principles to guide thinking. His method using data, logic, and clear language encourages us to dig deeper and think for ourselves. He showed that economic truth is not about ideology, but about outcomes and human dignity. 2. Inspiring the next generation. Young people today face a world full of opinions, but short on wisdom. In this environment, Friedman's calm, respectful style stands out. He didn't shout. He didn't shame. He explained. He invited people to explore ideas with an open mind, to debate respectfully, and to never stop learning. His famous debates with students and interviewers, now widely viewed online, continue to draw millions of views. Why? Because he made complicated issues simple without making them shallow. He showed how economic ideas touch everyday life, food prices, job choices, education options, and even freedom of speech. Many who watch these clips say the same thing. He made me think. That is perhaps his greatest gift. He empowered learners not with slogans, but with tools to understand the world. He helped people become more independent, more curious, and more confident in asking tough questions. 3. A role model of intellectual honesty. In a time of political division and emotional argument, Milton Friedman remains a rare example of intellectual humility and consistency. He was never afraid to say, "I was wrong," when the evidence demanded it. He didn't tailor his views to please political allies or gain power. His loyalty was to truth, not to party. He stood by unpopular positions if he believed they were right, whether on school choice, legalizing drugs, or cutting military drafts. This honesty gave him respect across ideological lines. Even those who disagreed with him admitted he made them think harder. He also defended freedom for everyone, not just for the rich or the strong. He believed liberty should be universal for the factory worker and the business owner, for the mother choosing her child's school and the citizen choosing what to say or believe. Friedman's vision of freedom wasn't narrow, it was deep. It was based on trust in human nature and on the belief that people, when respected and free, will build better lives and better societies. 4. The human touch behind the theories. In the end, what made Milton Friedman truly great was not just his intelligence, but his humanity. He didn't preach from a distance. He listened, he smiled, he engaged. He believed that people, all people, were capable of great things if given the chance. His life story, from the son of poor immigrants to one of the most respected thinkers of the 20th century, was a living example of what he taught, that freedom works and that anyone with effort and opportunity can make a difference. He treated students, critics, and allies with the same respect. He never claimed to know everything, but he never gave up seeking the truth. His partnership with Rose showed that intellectual brilliance could go hand in hand with warmth, humor, and lifelong love. They were not just co-authors, but co-dreamers, builders of a legacy that continues through institutions, books, and generations of grateful learners. 5. Keeping the flame alive. Today, as we face new challenges, climate concerns, AI disruption, global debt, and culture wars, Friedman's ideas remind us not to panic, but to think. He taught us to focus not on who has power, but on how to limit it wisely. He reminded us that freedom is fragile and must be renewed by every generation. To honor his legacy is not just to repeat his words, but to apply his spirit, to ask better questions, listen carefully, speak clearly, and believe that truth and freedom still matter. Milton Friedman still matters because he trusted people. He believed in their ability to learn, to choose, to grow. He believed that freedom is not a gift from government, but a right that belongs to each of us by nature. That belief continues to light the way. So long as we believe in the dignity of the individual, in their right to dream, to speak, to build, to be free, the flame that Milton Friedman lit will never go out. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.